server-side integration with AngularJS. We're talking about whether you're on Rails, Grails, .NET. It's really easy to generate a REST API. With that said, when you have a REST API, and even if it's Node or whatever, it really kind of becomes irrelevant what's on the back end and what's serving up your data. It's REST, it's JSON, I'm ready to go. And so that is even for people who are on kind of a legacy application server. So I've had specific questions about, like, I'm on .NET, we're moving away, how do you recommend that? It's like, well, get onto Node, replicate your API, and then start to piecemeal it out. So what we're going to cover in this module is REST and the HTTP service provider, promises, and real-time communication. That's just going to be a quick demo, but I wanted to show you some of the power within Firebase. It's ridiculous. So the HTTP service is basically a wrapper around the XML HTTP request object, and it's built around the Promises API. And so with HTTP and how that it's wired and you call it it's basically hooked into Promises. And so when you talk about that, HTTP, you kind of have to talk about Promises at the same time, which is a good thing, because I think that Promises solves a lot of problems around callbacks and nested callbacks. So I see that as a plus. And I'll show you kind of how that works in just a moment. So you have your various REST verbs. Angular has went ahead and created shortcut methods around these different verbs. With that said and you'll see this in the code when I show it to you, is that it almost becomes very almost conventional. Where if you're calling, like, I want to call this portion of the REST API, I want to call, like, users. And then I want to call, mailboxes, or I want to call this, is that you start to see a lot of the same code. And so it's very common to see in Angular, for at least my experience, is that you'll actually abstract that out into a base service. And so it's very common to see kind of like this HTTP base service that does a lot of the same stuff over and over. And then you will put your specific implementations on top of that. So that is just kind of an architectural consideration that you'll start to see kind of like, I'm calling a lot of the same stuff like over and over, is abstract that out into kind of a base service. So especially if you're using like cache or you have some like validation, is put that in the base service in one place and then defer to that from your specific implementations. But you have get and post are big ones. Put, delete. Head is a new one in 1.2, and what that does is it actually calls and basically says, has this thing changed? But it won't actually send the payload. But you can actually get the state of an object, and if it has not changed, well, then you don't have to get the payload. So it basically saves you from making an expensive call. So it's kind of like, hey, what's the status of this? And then JSON-P, it does that as well. Obviously, proceed with caution around JSON-P. There are some ways for that to go awry in terms from a security standpoint. So like I said, when you talk about the HTTP service, you kind of have to talk about promises because it's baked into that service. The return value of calling HTTP is a promise. From there, you can use the then method to register callbacks. And these callbacks receive a single argument, which is basically the result of your service call. So let me show you in the code what this actually looks like.